Bismillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Amma ba'd. This short talk is one of several that are taking place over the next few days in reference to white supremacy. I believe this is maybe the third or the fourth lecture that we've had, and today I'm sort of covering the evolution of white supremacy. We have to understand that ideologies are not static but organic, and they evolve over time. Ideologies and tactics used to control are ever evolving. They don't sit in one place too long, and they conform to the current situation. So again, today we're talking about the evolution of white supremacy, how white supremacy has evolved over the years in America. Why is this topic even important? This topic is important because we can't defend against what we don't understand. We can't fight against or eradicate what we don't understand. So understanding what white supremacy is, how it works, and how it stayed alive for so long is something that's very important. The first thing we should do is define white supremacy. Now, you will find variance in definition between some of the social sciences. You will find variance, if you go to Google and put in white supremacy and scroll down, you'll find variances in how it's defined. Again, because it's not static, it is organic. But the core of it stays the same. The core of white supremacy is white superiority over everyone else. I liken white superiority, or white supremacy rather, to a snowball. If you take a snowball and you pack it up, and then you roll that snowball down a hill, what does it do? It picks up momentum, number one, but it also picks up mass. The core of it is still there, but it's picking up mass, and that's what white supremacy does over time. Webster's dictionary defines white supremacy as a person or system that believes that the white race is inherently superior to other races, and that white people should control other races. This is Webster's dictionary of white supremacy. Elizabeth Martinez, who is a Chicana academic, she's also an activist, and she's written several books. I'm sorry, somebody just said my live went off. I really hope it didn't. Okay, anyway, Elizabeth Martinez, she's an academic, she's an author, and she's an activist who has written several books in reference to white supremacy and the Chicana situation. So she defines white supremacy as it's an historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white people and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. Now, another aspect to white supremacy is, at the core of it also, is capitalism. It's money. Sorry about that. Capitalism and money are at the core of it as well. And that's something that extends from the time of slavery to right now. And that's something important that we should understand. Another definition is it's a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, accept, and or live out superior societal definitions of self and to fit into and live out superior societal roles or social roles. These behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, and the outcome is white supremacy for those of white European descent to be on top and everyone else to be underneath them. The root of U.S. racial or U.S. racism or white supremacy lies in establishing economic exploitation by the theft of resources and human labor, then justify that exploitation by institutionalizing the inferiority of its victims. One of the tactics that's used by white superiority or white supremacy is to make the recipient of the white supremacy inferior. They have to be characterized as innately and intrinsically inferior to whites, therefore justifying whatever tactics they decide to use to dominate. White supremacy is an economic power, or white supremacy and economic power were born together. Again, look at capitalism. There is no way that we can break down in this short talk that I'm going to give all of the aspects of white supremacy. There'd be no way that we could break down in a short talk the impact, the total impact, the tactics of white supremacy from its inception here in America to now. That's something that would, you could do maybe in a semester in school, but not in a short talk. So what I can do now is touch on some of the stages of white supremacy that I feel are sort of key, that will give us a framework in order to build upon. The information that I give you tonight is information that, again, it's the beginning. It's the building blocks. From that, each individual should do his or her own research and build their own edifice to understand white supremacy and how it works. Now, the first stage of white supremacy, as far as America is concerned, began in 1619, approximately. We're talking about the beginning of slavery, when Africans were brought from Africa to America for the purpose of free labor in order to build a nation. Involved in that process, there were also poor Europeans. There were also some indigenous people. There were not enough Europeans, and the Indians were not having it. The indigenous people were not having it. Therefore, they had to reach out and retrieve Africans. Now, keep in mind, the indigenous people were viewed as subhuman and barbaric. Again, classifying them as subhuman and barbaric is the justification that's used to slaughter them. You make a people less than what they are. As Muslims, we understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created all humans, black, white, Asian, Indian, and other than that. And we're not judged by our skin color. The skin color is not what we are judged by. We're judged by our taqwa. We're judged by our power, our piety, and our worship of the Creator. When Africans were brought to the Americas, they too were given this or characterized as subhuman and or barbaric, therefore not worthy of humane treatment. Now, I want you to pay attention to the verbiage that I'm going to be using here in reference to the colonizers. The colonizers were English, they were Dutch, they were French, there were some Irish. The concept of weaponized whiteness didn't exist then. People identified based on where they're from. I'm from England, I'm from France, I'm Dutch, not identify as white. White being weaponized, white being the unifying factor. That didn't exist yet. So during this time, early whites identified based on where they were from. Now, there were also whites who were indentured servants, right? And they worked alongside the slaves. These indentured servants were paying off a debt in order to be set free, unlike the slaves who were just working for free and there was no freedom in their future. Well, the white elites, the plantation owners, they found themselves dangerously outnumbered by the workers, i.e. the poor Europeans and the Africans, and they were also surrounded by the indigenous population, who were not very happy with the colonizers being there. So what happened was the elites of that society, again, the plantation owners, they feared that the poor whites who were indentured servants would align themselves with the blacks and Indians and revolt. They were afraid that they were going to come together and take over. Just like now, you know, some tactics never change. They decided to divide and conquer. So they afforded the indentured servants certain rights, like land ownership. They could carry weapons. They could join militias, and some other rights that they did not afford to the black slaves. Now, keep in mind, the indentured servants and the black slaves at that time had more in common with themselves than they did with the bourgeoisie or the elite plantation owners. So the plantation owners divided them. They planted a wedge. They drove a wedge between the indentured servants and the blacks, and gave the indentured servants certain rights, which gave them a level of societal status higher than the slaves. The servants were then racially claimed. The indentured servants were then racially claimed as a part of the elite by skin color. Thus, whiteness as a weapon was born. By accepting the servants into the ranks, it bolstered their numbers and gave them a sense of security. Now they weren't so outnumbered by the blacks and by the Indians. After slavery was abolished, per se, you know, I was really going to skip the black codes and the black laws, but I'm going to touch on the black codes and the black laws because they are important. The black codes and the black laws were, after slavery was abolished and Africans were, or blacks were free, the elite plantation owners had a problem. They had a serious conundrum that they had to deal with. Even though slaves were free, the plantation still needed to be worked. The tobacco still needed to be harvested. The cotton still needed to be picked. Work still needed to be done. So they went to the state and they created these laws, these black codes or black laws, where blacks would be rounded up, charged with silly charges, loitering, sleeping outside, not having a job. They would be charged with these frivolous charges. Therefore, given a fine. You have to pay X amount of dollar to get out of the jail. Well, these are newly freed slaves. They did not have the ability, obviously, to pay fines. So they were given the option to go back to the plantation and continue to work off their debt. So again, we're looking at how systemic racism or systemic oppression evolves, how it morphs to fit the situation. Okay. After slavery, The dominant group, they became threatened by all of the newly freed slaves encroaching on their jobs as well as their housing and other goods and services. So attacks on blacks took several forms besides the obvious physical attacks. The other way to subjugate blacks were to take away or never give them, not take away, but never give them the right to vote. This ensures that blacks had zero political power. They had no say in forming policies that directly affected them as a collective. This allowed the whites to create systems and institutions that were advantageous for their long-term dominance. Now keep in mind, during both of these stages, the narrative of white superiority and manifest destiny and black inferiority, the black inferiority was considered to be biological. It was intrinsic. It was innate. Blacks were just less than or inferior to whites. This had been firmly rooted in the society at that time. The manifest destiny thing, I don't remember if I explained it or not, but manifest destiny was the idea that whites told themselves that they were superior to the indigenous people of the land that they came to. And because they were superior, they had a God-given mission to dominate them, to bring them civilization, to bring them Christianity, to dominate and take over the resources and use it for their benefit. It was ordained by God. So they told themselves this. It's called manifest destiny. So after this superior, inferior dynamic was firmly rooted in the society, this led to what's called de jure segregation. De jure segregation, the word de jure means, it's a Latin word, it means by law. It's state sanctioned and it's reinforced by legal code. This de jure segregation extended to all aspects of life. It's segregation. This segregation ensured that blacks maintained an inferior societal position. Everything was segregated: parks, jobs, restaurants, and this segregation or type of segregation created abject poverty and impotence in the newly freed slaves. They had no economic ground to stand on. They had no way to support themselves. They didn't have education. They didn't have anything. And the system was maintaining that. Again, we're talking about white superiority, or white supremacy rather. The purpose of it also is to maintain the status quo. And we'll get into systems and institutions a little bit later. But everyday interactions between blacks and whites proceeded according to highly formalized and rigidly followed codes of conduct intended to stress the inferior status of African Americans and their community. Whites were addressed as Mr. or Ma'am, whereas blacks were called by their first names or perhaps some honorific title such as aunt or uncle or something like this. Many times we know other names that they were called. Blacks were expected to assume a humble and deferential manner, remove their hats when they speak, cast their eyes down when they talk, and enact the role of a subordinate in all interactions with whites. So again, we look at white supremacy affects not only the economics of people, but it also affects the mentality, the thinking. Putting a group of people through this type of treatment, constantly being in an inferior position, always having to humble themselves, always being told that they are inferior, it becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell somebody something enough, they begin to believe it. Once they believe it, then they begin to act upon it. They begin to follow or stay in their lane, act their role, so to speak. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which extends long beyond slavery, and it extends long beyond the de jure segregation. So we're going to move a little bit forward here. Once you had the eradication of slavery, and you had the Jim Crow laws, and you had the de jure segregation, which was part and parcel of Jim Crow, because blacks were no longer slaves, they had the ability to break camp. They could move. So they decided to make a mass migration north. Many of the blacks went to Detroit, which is my home city. You'll find them in Chicago, mass migration to Chicago, Detroit, and some other cities north. That's why many black people can say they either know somebody in Detroit, or have family in Detroit, or know someone in Chicago, or have family in Chicago. It's due to that mass migration. Now, although life was better in the North and it was void of the Jim Crow laws, blacks still faced discrimination and hostile confrontation with low-wage white workers. We're talking about workers who worked in the factories, because blacks were getting away from the agricultural aspect of work and moving north. The North had been industrialized. So now the industry was, factory and textiles and things like this. So blacks moved into that industry and left the agricultural work behind. Well, what happened was the whites viewed blacks as a threat to their jobs, and unionized whites. Whites were unionized at that time. Blacks were often used as scabs and strike breakers. A scab is a group of people or a person who breaks a strike line. A strike is used as a tool or a tactic to force an employer to capitulate to whatever your demands are. Higher wages, health care, less working hours, whatever the case may be. Whatever the workers as a whole are asking for, they go on strike. Therefore, the factory is not working and the owner is not making money. So one of the two are going to break, right? So this is a tactic used by unions. Well, scabs were people that the employers could hire to go in and work. Well, I mean, blacks were in a situation where if work was available, they were going to take it. So they were often used as scabs and strike breakers. Now, this led to hostility between blacks and unionized low-wage whites. White immigrants worked, or the white immigrants who preceded the black slaves, the Irish and some of the other ones, they were viewed as a pariah to the society. The society hated these people, right? These immigrant workers from Ireland and some of these other countries. Well, after the migration of blacks, that paradigm changed, and immigrant workers were again accepted by the dominant group, once again bolstering their numbers, and not only bolstering their number but their power, and making blacks the focus of their collective vitriol and antipathy. So we've looked at economics, we've looked at the psychological aspect of white supremacy. Now, this third stage, before I define this stage, and I'm actually wrapping this up. Here. Before I define the stage, I want to cover some info, and let me see if you can figure out the new face of white supremacy. What is the current call of the white supremacist? The current call of the white supremacist is not the call previously. Remember, I likened white supremacy to a snowball that you roll down a hill. The core of it stays the same, but it picks up mass. It picks up weight and power along the way. And this is what white supremacy does. It changes and it morphs. The definitions of these words, because of that, need to evolve as well. Before I get into this last part, one of the reasons that you find variance in definition for these words is that they evolve so quickly. The definitions of these words evolve based on information and based on knowledge and based on research about these topics. We learn things about them, therefore the definition must mature. We look at racism. Racism back in the day was defined as disliking a person or group based on their skin color. That was pretty much how everyone understood racism. 2020, that's a very facile and immature and undeveloped understanding of what racism is. We understand now, based on research, that racism is based on not only a bigotry or a dislike or a hate, but it's coupled with power. So you have power plus that vitriol, that antipathy toward whatever group it happens to be, coupled together. Now you can determine the outcomes of groups. You can subjugate, you can make periphery, you can marginalize groups that you dislike. So racism is more than just disliking a group based on their skin color, but racism is now, it's understood as having the ability to determine the outcomes of these groups that the society deems to be less than. Okay. Some of the numbers that I'm going to throw at you now are taken from the Brookings Institute, Pew Research Institute, National Geographic, and the U.S. Census Bureau. So who is the Brookings Institute? And this is very important in research. You should always know your sources. You should have some idea of who they are. The Brookings Institute is a nonprofit public policy organization based in Washington, D.C. The mission of the organization is to conduct in-depth research that leads to new ideas for problem solving facing society at the local, national, and global levels. It's supposed to be unbiased, nonpartisan. The Brookings Institute and the U.S. Census Bureau, their timelines for what I'm getting ready to tell you are pretty close, almost exact. They say that by the year 2044, the majority of the U.S. population will be people of color. According to analysis of the Bureau of the Census Projects, by 2044, the United States will have no clear racial or ethnic majority. According to new population projections, whites will make up 49.7% of the population, followed by Latinos, who will make up 25%, African Americans at 13.1%. I question that one right there because blacks seem to never make it past 13% of the population. So for me, as a researcher, that's one of those things that I would really have to verify. I'd really have to look at that one. But based on the numbers presented by these two groups, this is what they come up with. Asians at 7.9% and multiracial population at 3.7% and rising. The Latino and Asian population are the fastest growing populations in the United States. Between 2000 and 2010, the country's Asian population grew by 46.8%. During the same period, the Latino population grew by 43.9%. By 2050, the Latino population is expected to exceed 100 million individuals, while the Asian population is expected to grow to approximately 42 million individuals. Keep in mind, when we look at sheer numbers, when we look at immigration, people of color coming from India, people of color coming from Mexico, coming from South America, coming from Africa, coming from Arabia, when we look at interracial relationships, when we look at birth rates and death rates, from what I read, white Europeans or white Americans, I'll keep it here, they only have 1.5 children on average, whereas Africans, Arabs, and other groups may have 5, 10, or even more children. So by sheer numbers, it's only a matter of time before what we understand to be the typical white American does not exist anymore. They're going to be wiped out if we just go by the numbers alone. Interracial relationships, immigration, when we talk about birth rates and death rates. National Geographic also stated that by 2050, the majority of the people of the United States will be racially ambiguous. And if you Google National Geographic average American 2050, you'll see pictures of what they say the average American will look like. They are beige skin, lighter eyes, long curly hair, but they're not white. They're definitely a person of color. So what is the call of the day for the white supremacist? What do you think it is? The white supremacy ideology in the United States is dominated by the belief that whites are doomed to extinction by a rising tide of non-whites who are controlled and manipulated, they say, by Jews. Unless action is taken now, this core belief is exemplified by their slogan, such as the so-called 14 words. This is what they have. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. This is their slogan. So now the call is not so much economic as it was before. Now the call is we're going to be extinct. And when we look at the numbers, to be quite honest, it's a valid fear. They have the right to be fearful of that. When you look at the birth rates, they said that the average age of a white American male is 58 years old, whereas the average age of a minority right now is only 27. You know what I mean? So the minorities, who are the minorities now, are younger, while the older whites are dying off. And then the population of the people of color is being replenished at a high rate, whereas the population of whites is going down. So from a numeric perspective, their fear is legitimate. But it's not something that I don't think can be stopped. Now, let's look at another aspect of white supremacy. These white supremacists who look at the numbers, who are educated, and that's another thing. There's a saying amongst the people that the racists went from boots to suits. When you remember the old skinheads, right? If you Google the skinhead, you see them, they have on the blue jeans, they wear the military style boots. That's the old racist model. That's the old white supremacist uniform. Now they wear suits. Now they wear police uniforms. So they're different. I have a friend of mine, a guy I've known for a long time. He works for the police department. And he told me that he honestly, and he's been on the police department 24 years. He honestly believes that white supremacist groups send their members out to join police departments throughout the country for the purpose of the destruction of people of African descent or people of color. He's been on the police force for 24 years. White supremacy now is about survival. It's not so much about economics. Remember the snowball effect. Economics is always going to be part of it. That white superiority is always going to be at its core. But survival is now the call of the day for the white supremacist. The white supremacist who is educated, and this is another thing. They say now that the majority of these white supremacists are not these toothless hillbillies that we've always had in our mind, we've always seen depicted in movies. But again, these are guys who are wearing suits, who are educated, many of them college educated. And because they are educated, they have access to data, they have access to information, they can see that they are on their way out numerically. So they create mass incarceration. Mass incarceration keeps the men from reproducing. They push and promote the homosexual lifestyle in the black community. For the purpose of what? For the purpose of lessening reproduction. We have to understand that their survival is what they're fighting for right now. So we have to take seriously and have a level of gravitas in how we understand and how we approach white supremacy. So with that, I will leave it there. I'll leave it there. I think that's enough. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message. And if I can elucidate on anything that I have said today, I will be more than glad. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.